November 14th, 1942. The Iron Bottom Sound, Solomon Islands. The heavy cruiser Kinugasa burned violently against the bruised purple dusk, a dying giant, groaning as its bulkheads buckled under the pressure of the Pacific Ocean. Around it, the water was choked with oil and debris, the aftermath of a brutal, chaotic naval engagement. From the bridge of his flagship at Truk Lagoon, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the stoic architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, watched the damage reports flooding into his headquarters. On the surface, it looked like another tactical victory for the Empire. They had inflicted heavy losses on the American fleet. The carrier USS Hornet was gone, sunk to the bottom, and the legendary USS Enterprise was reported heavily damaged, perhaps fatal. The mood among the junior officers was electric. They believed they had broken the back of the U.S. Navy. But Yamamoto did not smile. He sat in silence, staring at a new intelligence dossier that had just landed on his desk, a document that terrified him more than any bomb. The report didn't just list American losses. It listed arrivals. Fresh destroyers were appearing in the theater. New transport ships loaded with supplies were docking in Australia. These were vessels that, according to Japanese manufacturing timelines and intelligence estimates, shouldn't even exist yet. Yamamoto's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He knew the United States better than any man in the Imperial High Command. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen the smokestacks of Detroit and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. He famously warned the Prime Minister before the war began, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." It was now month 11. The timeline had expired. As he read the tonnage numbers, a chill colder than the ocean spray crept down his spine. The Americans weren't just fighting back. They were regenerating like a mythical hydra. For every ship the Japanese Navy sank, the American industrial machine seemed to birth 2 more. Yamamoto realized with a sinking heart that the sleeping giant he feared was not just awake, it was building a war machine at a speed that defied the laws of reality. The tactical victories in the Solomons were meaningless if the strategic equation had already shifted. The war was no longer about courage, it was about calculus, and the numbers were turning against Japan with terrifying speed.
To understand the coming catastrophe, one had to look into the soul of the Japanese Navy. Men like signalman Kenji Tanaka, serving on the destroyer Amikiri, revered Admiral Yamamoto as a god of war. Tanaka and his crew were the product of a martial tradition that spanned centuries. They believed in the invincibility of the Imperial Navy, driven by Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan. To them, war was an art form. They trained relentlessly in night-fighting tactics, relying on superior optics and sheer will to overcome the enemy. They viewed the Americans as soft, dependent on luxury, and unwilling to sacrifice. But this philosophy hid a fatal flaw. Japan fought a war of decisive battles, hoping to break the enemy's morale. The Americans were preparing for a war of attrition, intending to break the enemy's physics. The samurai spirit was formidable, but it was about to collide with a force it couldn't bleed, couldn't scare, and couldn't outlast: the relentless, deafening roar of American mass production. Thousands of miles away from the blood-soaked waters of the Pacific, on the coast of Richmond, California, the air didn't smell of salt or fear. It smelled of welding ozone, burning metal, and unbridled ambition. This was the Kaiser shipyard, ground zero of the American industrial miracle. The man in charge, Henry J. Kaiser, had absolutely zero prior naval experience. He was a dam builder, a paunchy industrialist with thick glasses who looked at a battleship and saw just another construction project. The Navy brass hated him initially, calling his methods reckless. But Kaiser didn't care about naval tradition. He cared about speed. His shipyard was a chaotic symphony of production that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under the glare of massive floodlights. Thousands of workers, including housewives, grandmothers, and former waitresses, the famous Rosie the Riveters, swarmed over massive steel skeletons like ants on a carcass. Kaiser's radical idea was prefabrication. Before the war, a ship was built like a house. You laid the keel, the foundation, and slowly built up from there, meaning one slipway could only work on one ship at a time. Kaiser threw that rule book into the fire. He decentralized the entire process. They built the bow in one factory, the cabins in another, the engine room in a third, and the midsection in a fourth. Then, giant cranes, larger than anything seen in Japan, lifted these massive multi-ton sections and dropped them into place, where welders fused them together like a colossal 3D puzzle. The speed was terrifying. Before the war, a standard cargo ship took about 200 days to build. Kaiser wanted it done in weeks. He stripped the ships of unnecessary luxuries, standardized the parts so a valve from a ship in New York would fit a ship in California, and pushed his workforce to the breaking point. The result was a flood of steel. While Japanese admirals were debating the perfect angle of a pagoda mast, Kaiser was churning out hulls that were ugly, simple, and utterly functional. He wasn't building ships for a parade, he was building trucks for the ocean. The sheer noise of the Richmond yards, the riveting guns, the cranes, the shouting foremen was the sound of the Japanese Empire's doom echoing across the continent long before the first torpedo was fired. The pace at the American shipyards turned from urgent to impossible, culminating in a publicity stunt that was actually a terrifying display of raw capability. In November 1942, to prove to the world and the Axis powers that American industry was untouchable, Kaiser's team set out to break the world record for ship construction with the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary. The clock started the moment the keel was laid, just after midnight on a Sunday. What followed was a blur of synchronized chaos. The prefabricated sections, already waiting on the dock, were swung into place immediately. By Tuesday, the ship was fully formed, a steel mountain rising from the slipway. By Wednesday, the wiring and piping were being installed, while the deck was still being welded. By Thursday, it was being painted, the smell of fresh gray paint mixing with the smoke of the welding torches. On November 12, 1942, just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after construction began, the ship was launched into the water. It wasn't a hollow shell. It was a fully functional cargo vessel, ready to be fitted out and sent to war. The news of this feat rippled through the intelligence communities of the world. To the Japanese engineers at the Kure Arsenal, who were meticulously hand-polishing turbine blades for a single destroyer over the course of weeks, this report read like science fiction. America had just spat out a 10,000-ton ship in less than a week, and it wasn't just cargo ships. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard and Newport News, the massive Essex-class aircraft carriers, floating cities of destruction, carrying 90 planes each, were entering the same mass production logic. Standardized parts, round-the-clock shifts, infinite resources. Henry Kaiser coined a phrase that would come to haunt the Japanese command: "We can build them faster than they can sink them." America had successfully turned the war into a manufacturing problem, and they were solving it with brute force volume. Every rivet driven into the Robert E. Peary was a nail in the coffin of the Axis powers. The message was clear: you can sink our ships, you can kill our crews, but you cannot stop the assembly line. The ocean was about to become very crowded.
Back in the Pacific, the psychological impact of this industrial tsunami began to take hold on the Japanese frontline sailors. They started to feel like they were fighting ghosts. The most terrifying example of this phenomenon was the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. The Japanese Navy had reported sinking her multiple times. After the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, they celebrated her destruction. The Tokyo radio waves cheered the death of the American carrier fleet. But weeks later, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, there she was again. the gray ghost on the horizon, launching planes, dealing death. The Japanese command was baffled. How could a ship declared sunk return to the fight so quickly? The answer lay in the American philosophy of damage control and repair. When the Enterprise was damaged, she wasn't sent back to a dry dock in Pearl Harbor for a year of careful restoration. She was patched up at sea, often with repair crews still welding on the deck and fixing the flight elevators while the ship steamed back into battle at full speed. The Americans prioritized functionality over perfection. If it floated and could launch planes, it was a warship. To the exhausted Japanese crews, like Kenji Tanaka's unit, who hadn't seen a relief ship in 6 months and whose own damaged vessels were languishing in distant ports, this was utterly demoralizing. Tanaka, watching the radar screen during a night watch, whispered to his captain, "We sink them, and they just rise from the dead." The psychological weight of fighting an undead enemy began to crack the iron discipline of the Imperial fleet. Every time they thought they had achieved a victory, the horizon would fill with American silhouettes again. They weren't fighting a navy, they were fighting a hydra. The Enterprise became a symbol of the futility of the Japanese war effort, a constant reminder that no matter how hard they hit, the enemy could absorb the blow and keep coming. The belief in spiritual superiority was crumbling under the weight of material reality. By late 1943, the Ghost Fleet had become a solid wall of steel, but numbers were only half the story. The technology gap was widening into a chasm. In the early days of the war, Japanese optics were superior. Their binoculars and night vision training allowed them to see the enemy first, but American ships arriving from the new factories were equipped with advanced centimetric radar. This technology allowed American gunners to see in pitch-black darkness, through fog, and over the horizon. They could lock on to a Japanese ship 8 miles away at night and fire a salvo of shells that landed with devastating precision before the Japanese even knew they were there. It was like fighting a sniper who could see in the dark while you were blindfolded. Furthermore, American anti-aircraft shells were now equipped with the VT, Variable Time Proximity Fuse. This was a tiny radar set inside the tip of the shell that detected when it was close to a Japanese plane and detonated automatically. Japanese pilots used to dodging direct hits suddenly found the sky filled with unavoidable shrapnel. Yamamoto's nightmare had fully materialized. He was dead now, shot down over Bougainville in an ambush orchestrated using decrypted intelligence, but his prediction was living on. The sheer tonnage of American war material arriving in the Pacific was staggering. Supply convoys stretched from the horizon to the shore, unloading mountains of spam, fuel, and ammunition. Japanese garrisons were starving, rationing rice and bullets, cutting down jungle trees for fuel. Meanwhile, American sailors were eating fresh meat and ice cream made on dedicated ice cream barges. It was a humiliation of logistics. Tanaka, now serving on a transport trying to run supplies to desperate troops, saw the ocean crowded with enemy silhouettes. The feeling of invincibility was gone, replaced by the crushing, claustrophobic realization of being outnumbered and out-teched 1 to 10. The ocean was no longer theirs. June 1944, the Philippine Sea. This was supposed to be the decisive battle where Japan would turn the tide, the Kantai-Ketsen they had planned for decades. The Japanese High Command scraped together everything they had left, 9 aircraft carriers and their remaining air groups. On paper, it was a formidable force, a gathering of eagles, but as they approached the Marianas Islands to defend their inner defense ring, they ran into Task Force 58. The scale of this American fleet was something the human race had never seen before. 15 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, over 900 combat aircraft. It was an armada that covered the ocean's surface for miles, a floating continent of steel. When the Japanese launched their attack, hoping for a warrior's duel, they didn't meet equals, they met a meat grinder. The Japanese pilots were green, hastily trained replacements because their veterans had all died in attrition battles. The American pilots flying against them were well-rested, flying superior F-6 Hellcat fighters that had been mass-produced by the thousands in American factories. The result was not a battle, it was a slaughter. American pilots dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
Japanese planes fell from the sky like rain. Tanaka watched from the deck of his ship as the pride of the Imperial Air Service was swatted away effortlessly. It wasn't just skill. The Americans simply had more of everything. More fuel to train pilots for hundreds of hours. More planes to fly, more ammo to shoot. The samurai spirit charged the machine, and the machine didn't even blink. By the end of the day, the Japanese carrier force had been stripped of its aircraft, rendered useless. The battle proved that courage alone could not stop a conveyor belt of destruction. The American factories had populated the sky with so much aluminum and death that the Japanese pilot skill was rendered irrelevant.
While the battles raged and the headlines focused on the carriers, the Americans revealed another industrial secret weapon that broke the Japanese strategic back: Ulithi Atoll. This wasn't a factory. It was a forward base in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. But it wasn't just a harbor. The U.S. Navy had brought the shipyard to the battle. They towed massive floating dry docks, mobile repair stations the size of stadiums, all the way across the Pacific. These behemoths could submerge, allow a damaged destroyer or cruiser to float over them, and then pump out the water to lift the entire ship into the air. A destroyer could be torpedoed on Tuesday, limp into Ulithi on Wednesday, be lifted entirely out of the water by these floating docks, patched up by a 24-hour crew of mechanics and welders, and be sent back to the front line by the next week. Contrast this with the tragic fate of the Japanese battleship Yamamoto. The greatest, most powerful battleship ever built was currently sitting idle in a Japanese harbor, a caged tiger. Why? Because Japan didn't have enough fuel to run her, nor the specific steel alloys to repair her minor battle damage. She waited weeks for parts that never came. The agility of American logistics meant their ships had an operational uptime of nearly 90%, while Japanese ships spent half the war transiting to and from distant repair yards. At Ulithi, the Americans had everything: floating hotels for weary sailors, repair ships, oil tankers, and ammunition ships. They had effectively built a major American industrial city in the middle of a coral reef. This logistical dominance meant the Japanese could never catch a break. There was no lull in the fighting because the American fleet never had to go home. They lived on the doorstep of the empire, constantly refueled and repaired by a supply chain that stretched uninterrupted back to San Francisco. As 1945 dawned, the war had become a suffocating siege. The statistics of production tell the story of the defeat better than any explosion ever could. In the critical years of 1943 and 1944 combined, the United States laid down the halls for and launched over 90 aircraft carriers of various types, including the massive fleet carriers and the smaller escort carriers. In that same period, Imperial Japan, straining every muscle of its economy, starving its civilians to feed the factories, managed to launch just 7. The ratio was beyond comprehension. It was nearly 13-1. Japan was trying to stop a tsunami with a bucket. The ocean lanes were completely choked with American vessels. The Ghost Fleet had done its job. U.S. submarines, built in the dozens, had strangled the Japanese merchant marine. The Silent Service sank the tankers bringing oil from the Dutch East Indies. The factories in Tokyo and Osaka stopped running, not just because of bombing, but because raw materials simply couldn't be imported. The steel noose had tightened. Japanese destroyers sat rusting in port because there was no fuel to turn their propellers. The civilian population was reduced to eating acorn paste and sawdust. The American strategy was no longer about winning battles. It was about total resource denial. They had converted their economic power into a weapon more deadly than any bomb. The Ghost Fleet was no longer haunting them, it was starving them. The American supply chain was so robust that they could afford to waste ammunition, firing thousands of rounds to kill a single sniper, while Japanese soldiers were ordered to use their bayonets to save bullets. It was the ultimate mismatch, a nation that counted every grain of rice versus a nation that paved airstrips with coral and discarded trucks when they ran out of gas. The industrial disparity had turned the war into a grim execution.
The war ended not with a final glorious charge of the samurai, but with the collapse of an exhausted, starved, and burned-out nation. Kenji Tanaka survived the war, a ghost of his former self. Standing on the deck of a repatriation ship in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, he looked out at the gathered Allied fleet. It was a sight that defied description. It was a sea of steel. American ships stretched as far as the eye could see, blotting out the water. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, carriers, hospital ships, transports, thousands of them. Many built in those frantic, noisy days at the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond. He saw the flags snapping in the wind, the pristine paint, the sailors in clean white uniforms. He realized then, with a profound sadness, that the war had been lost not in 1945, but in 1942, the moment the first rivet was driven into a Liberty ship hull in California. In a post-war interrogation, a high-ranking Japanese naval officer summed it up to his American captors with a heavy heart. He looked at the charts of American production and said, "You surely know that we could not compete. We fought with the spirit of the samurai. You fought with the capacity of the machine." The history books would record the battles of Midway and Iwo Jima, but the ocean floor remembered the truth. Victory belonged to the factories. The Ghost Fleet had been real. It wasn't magic. It was the sheer, overwhelming force of a unified industrial power. It was the welders, the riveters, the logistics officers, and the supply clerks who had defeated the Imperial Navy. As Tanaka looked one last time at the endless fleet, he understood that bravery could win a battle, but only logistics could win a war. The sun set over Tokyo Bay, casting long shadows over the greatest armada in human history, a fleet born from smoke and steel that had washed away the old world with an unstoppable tide. The samurai had drawn his sword, but the machine had simply paved over him.